I would like to start by complimenting Emily Gallard.
Merci beaucoup. J'aimerais d'abord.
I think she has done tremendous work in organizing this summer session, and I want to extend my warmest greetings to all the young people who are the future, who are here today. It's a great pleasure for me to speak. We are in the midst of a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, in which we're the major force affecting the planet and our human environment. 50 years after the United Nations Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment, we're imperiling the health and the well-being of future generations and planet Earth. We can no longer ignore the rights of future generations. Intergenerational equity has become central. So the question is, how do we make intergenerational equity a reality in today's world? To gain perspective on this question, I think it is useful to review the evolution of intergenerational equity during the last 40 years. And this is especially the case because one of the important initiatives took place in France. In the early 1980s, the United Nations University, after a conference at the Hague Academy of International Law, decided to pursue the question of fairness to future generations. With the initiative of then Vice Rector Edward Ploman from Sweden, the United Nations University supported my project on international law, common patrimony, and intergenerational equity, enabling me to set up a small international advisory group consisting of then eminent jurists from France, Professor Alexandre Kiss, Brazil, the late Judge Antonio Cansado Trindade, from China, Professor Lai Ping Cheng, and from India, Judge R.S. Pathak. The study which I authored articulated a theory of intergenerational equity in which we inherited a natural and cultural patrimony from past generations, both as beneficiaries and as custodians, with the duty to pass this heritage to future generations in no worse condition than received from the past. This required conserving options, conserving quality, and providing non-discriminatory access to benefits. And on the basis of this study, the advisory group drafted in 1988 the Goa Guidelines on Intergenerational Equity, named after the place where they were drafted in India. As we've heard, Tony Aposa put intergenerational equity into action by bringing his famous lawsuit before the Philippines Supreme Court. In the 1980s, in France, Jacques-Yves Cousteau launched a major international initiative on future generations. To quote Cousteau in 1992, quote, "We know that our tenure on Earth is short, that future generations of human beings will come after us, but we are living as if there is no tomorrow. Let us care for the future," he said, "by taking steps now to switch from a short-sighted, death-driven course to a path that cherishes life," unquote. In the early 1980s, Cousteau asked a small group of philosophers, biologists, and physicians to draft a text on the rights of future generations, which had 5 articles. In the mid-1980s, he invited me to join his advisory group, and he was responsible for having my book, In Fairness to Future Generations, translated into French and published by the United Nations University, Saint-Terre, and UNESCO. At Cousteau's initiative, UNESCO held a workshop in La Laguna, Tenerife, to draft a declaration on future generations, and I joined Cousteau there. This declaration contributed to the UNESCO initiative later under Federico Moyor for the UNESCO Declaration on the Responsibilities of the Present Generations to Future Generations. After Cousteau's death, we presented Cousteau's petition to the then UN Secretary General for a declaration on future generations. He had a petition that he had circulated throughout many, many countries for people to sign up to protect future generations. As I listened to the eulogies in Notre Dame for Jake, I knew that one of his pioneering contributions would be his effort to enlist people worldwide to sign on to caring about future generations. When these efforts in the 1980s were initiated, the international system was significantly different than today. States were supreme, and the international order was hierarchical. The focus in the several decades following has been on the public sector, drafting legal instruments, bringing cases in national courts, subnational courts, and to some extent, international courts, including provisions regarding the future and future generations in national constitutions and provincial constitutions, and establishing special institutions within governments and parliaments to try to ensure that future generations are considered in the decision-making process or in the implementation of decisions. These have been largely targeted on sustainable development issues. These issues and actions remain essential and must continue to be pursued. But we are now living in a kaleidoscopic world, and I hope you're familiar with what a kaleidoscope looks like. There are many different actors, many influences on the kaleidoscope, and diverse normative instruments. Change takes place rapidly. Multiple actors shape the patterns in the kaleidoscope. And it's in this context, I suggest that we need to expand our vision of considering and protecting the rights of future generations. In this framework, considering the future becomes a critical element in much of what we do. We need to reach more actors to expand our understanding of relevant issues and concerns, to extend our accepted normative sources, including non-binding legal instruments and individualized voluntary commitments, to engage local communities as well as regional, national, and international ones, and really to get all of us involved in making intergenerational equity a reality. States remain essential. They are the public backbone for our efforts. But we also have to involve civil society, non-governmental organizations, and the private sector, including companies, banks, and other financial institutions. These actors are essential to protecting the rights of future generations. They can also impede efforts to do so, and this must be addressed. Geographically, actions that affect future generations run the spectrum from local to international. Some problems are inherently global, such as climate change or depletion of the ozone layer. Others are primarily regional, such as pollution of regional seas. Many may be local with global impact, such as the loss of biological diversity or the degradation of soils and loss of fresh water. Some are really critical at the community level with international implications, such as the loss of cultural knowledge, cultural practices and languages, and the very important problems of environmental justice. We need a framework that encompasses all of these elements. Within the kaleidoscopic world, we need to ask, what kind of world do future generations want? And what actions can we take to help bring this about? We can't know in detail the preferences of future generations, especially a long time in the future. But we can assume certain preferred basic features for now, namely a stable climate, a robust and resilient natural environment, a healthy human environment, including a level of nuclear radiation compatible with a healthy life, and a world increasingly free of poverty, a world that provides its population with improved health and nutrition, education, opportunity, and human dignity. What then, if we are to assume the intergenerational lens, are potential strategies for making intergenerational equity a reality? And I will focus briefly on 6 of them. First and foremost, of course, we have to give representation to the interests of future generations in the decisions we take today, and to be able to prevent or limit actions that would harm them. As has been noted, legislation, judicial litigation, and institutional innovations are essential. Second, we need to focus on what I call a sustainable trajectory. This means that we do not simply consider a sustainable condition at a given moment in time or at the moment we inherit it, but rather we consider the long-term implications of what is needed and the effects long-term of our actions today. It requires attention to the long term to ensure that the trajectory we are explicitly or implicitly invoking is a sustainable one in the long term. Relatedly, we need to engage in long-term assessments of proposed policies and actions, both in the public and the private sectors, monitoring the health of our planet and its resources, including water, soils, the status of certain sectors such as agriculture and energy, and a host of health and social factors is also essential. And indeed, the Sustainable Development Goals are directed to this. Third, a third strategy is to engage in scientific and technical research on issues of concern for future generations that might not otherwise be funded privately or publicly. Let's take groundwater aquifers. This calls for identifying aquifer pollution, understanding the transport of the pollutants, and monitoring the pollution, all intergenerational concerns. Support is needed for innovation that conserves our planet and its resources, and that helps future generations to meet their own needs. Natural and social science research on issues concerned with the long-term problems of sustainability is also important, especially climate change and its implications for energy, agriculture, land use, urban planning, water resources, and environmental justice, to name a few. An important element of intergenerational equity is inclusivity of researchers from diverse countries. A fourth strategy concerns investments and policy decisions. And especially investment decisions are usually determined by purely short-term considerations, and often even usually made in the private sector. Those who take these decisions need to take account of the benefits and costs of future generations. This is controversial, but for some decisions, such as those by fossil fuel and mining companies, the implications can be significant. Moreover, it may be appropriate for regulators to require consideration of the issues from the companies in their reports, such as the implications of climate change. In a similar vein, international financial institutions, investment banks, and other financial institutions could consider risks and benefits to future generations in their analysis and assessments. A fifth strategy, education for all peoples on the effects of our actions today on future generations. And having the relevant information, having access to the relevant information is an important element of education. It's also very useful to develop international platforms for what works in conserving the planet for future generations or locally, and for other aspects of intergenerational equity, which can then serve educational purposes and means of empowering people to act. Finally, the normative basis for considering the future needs to be conserved and expanded. A United Nations Declaration for the Future would be an important advance. A principle of intergenerational equity calls for comparable options, namely diversity, comparable quality, and comparable access, as articulated in the United Nations Secretary General's report in 2013. Many different legal instruments can incorporate intergenerational equity, including those that are non-binding and those that only offer guidance or codes of conduct. We have to advance the legal basis for recognizing and implementing rights of future generations. Now I want to step even further down practically. I want to look at immediate steps to implement intergenerational equity. We need to answer the question, what steps can we take on Monday morning or the first day of the week to conserve the planet for ourselves and for future generations and to implement intergenerational equity? I want to offer only a few concrete examples of an intergenerational perspective. They're intended to indicate the difference that a concern for the future makes. And the first is nuclear energy. When we dispose of nuclear wastes in deep geological formations or elsewhere, we need to record the scientific assumptions and information on the safety of the disposal and the risks of it, so that future generations can evaluate safety and identify risks. Or when we build nuclear reactors, we need to plan for the decommissioning of the reactors, as by building them to facilitate later decontamination, and by considering the ease and cost of decommissioning the reactors. Another example, when we're constructing infrastructure, such as wastewater treatment plants, we need to consider the maintenance costs of the plant and not just the cost of the capital investment. Or to turn to freshwater, an increasingly important problem. And here I refer both to surface and to groundwater. And there are at least three kinds of actions that prejudice future generations. Actions that pollute water with toxic chemicals, hazardous wastes, and even salt from agriculture or sea level rise. Actions that consume groundwater in excess of the natural recharge rates, or mine fossil groundwater aquifers with no concern for the long term. And actions that engineer large-scale diversions of water from rivers and lakes. Often these actions harm those today who are least able to cope with the problems and may benefit only a few, but they also threaten future generations. Protecting recharge areas of aquifers, which is a land use issue, limiting pumping of aquifers, controlling disposal of wastes and toxic chemicals, carefully assessing and controlling large-scale diversion of waters are all actions that can be considered and taken in the immediate term to protect the rights of future generations. That is broadened back now and returned to the kaleidoscopic world. And let's ask the question, what are subject areas for intergenerational equity in light of the kaleidoscopic world and in light of today? And I suggest that the scope of the problems extends for future generations beyond those that are traditionally associated with our actions in the Anthropocene. This makes caring for the future even more challenging. I want to highlight only some of these of special concern for intergenerational equity. First, of course, are natural resources and pollution. Certain natural resources are inherently of concern to future generations because they have long regeneration times. These include oceans, atmosphere, soils, lake and river bottoms, groundwater aquifers, biodiversity, and even forests. Biodiversity is really of critical concern because it's the key to the resilience of ecosystems and the protection against zoonosis. Certain pollutants are also inherently of concern to future generations because of their long residency times or their potency with long-term effects. For example, nuclear waste, burned out nuclear fuel, persistent organic pollutants, greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide, toxic chemicals, ozone depleting chemicals. A second subject area is cultural resources, both the physical and non-physical. They are an important component of intergenerational equity. They provide future generations with a sense of ongoing community with the past and the peoples, with a rich resource base upon which to build and to continue their societies, with essential knowledge for living in the natural system, and with artistic and many other pleasures. The conservation of knowledge and the practices of indigenous peoples, especially related to natural systems, and conservation of their languages is, I suggest, a part of intergenerational equity. Another part relates to the generation and retention of data and of knowledge. These raise intergenerational issues. We need to keep data, information, and knowledge that are needed for the welfare of future generations. We need to verify their authenticity, and we need to ensure accessibility to the. This latter point of accessibility is really important now in light of the many new and changing formats for retaining information and data. We could consider criteria for retaining them and for making them accessible now and to future generations. Otherwise, decisions will be made implicitly on an ad hoc basis without regard to the interests of future generations. And now I turn to a fourth. Rare natural disasters have catastrophic consequences for future generations, and they are relevant to making intergenerational equity a reality. These disasters include earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and tsunamis. And now we have seen a catastrophic and very tragic flooding in Pakistan. This means developing and maintaining warning systems for such disasters and preparing for responding to such events. A fifth subject area is that international generational considerations extend to armed conflict. Nuclear war is an existential threat. The protection of civilian nuclear power plants from attacks concerns future generations. Chemical and biological weapons can affect the environment of future generations. And I appreciate very much Normandy's focus on peace. And 6, the ultimate intergenerational problem, of course, is climate change. But what intergenerational equity means is addressing climate change now, before we cross tipping points with catastrophic results for the future. In all of these areas that I've identified here, the acceptance of a common norm of fairness to future generations is critical. That norm, together with norms of cooperation, avoidance of harm, and very importantly, accountability, provide an underlying glue to keep the many components of the kaleidoscopic world on the same trajectory and to maintain peace now and in the future. And now I want to turn to youth. But before I do so, I want to compliment Emily once again for the work that she has been doing on future generations and for the impact that it is having. And I turn now to youth. You are the standard bearers of future generations. To all of you at this course, you are the voice of greater equity today, and you are the torch for the rights of future generations. You're really the linchpin of the future. I am personally very excited to know that you'll be there, and it's my great honor to have the chance to speak to you as you go forward with this mission. Thank you very much.